Imagine choosing to amputate your own finger with
Yeah.
a rusty, completely improvised blade over a crude game of cards.
It's a game of cards, yeah.
Right. And doing it simply to prove that you owe absolutely nothing to the government that imprisoned you.
It's wild.
I mean, imagine you're sitting in this freezing, desolate tundra, starving to the point of emaciation, right? And you decide that lifting a single wooden log to help the state is a fate far worse than being beaten to death by the guards.
Which is exactly what happened.
Yeah,
And that level of ideological fanaticism, it completely breaks our modern understanding of how criminal networks are supposed to operate.
totally.
Because we're conditioned to think of organized crime as this hyper-capitalist pursuit.
Right, get this. It is the exact opposite of what we uncovered when we were poring over the sources for our deep dive into the Harvey Weinstein case.
Oh, completely. Night and day.
Because in Hollywood, or, on Wall Street for that matter, the ultimate goal of a criminal conspiracy is to get incredibly comfortable.
Yeah. You build power, you accumulate massive wealth.
You use the legal system to hide your money. You hire these ridiculously expensive lawyers to draft non-disclosure agreements.
The Complicity Machine.
Exactly. It's a complicity machine built entirely on leveraging the existing system to protect your status. But then you step into the dusty, freezing, brutal archives of Soviet history, and suddenly that whole corporate model of crime is completely shattered. Today we are going from the red carpet to the red gulag.
I love that framing. And our mission in this deep dive is to really synthesize a mountain of historical evidence to decode something truly paradoxical.
We've got a lot of material today.
We do. We are working through Mark Cagliotti's definitive research in his book, The Vory. We've got academic papers by Federico Varese on the structure of Soviet crime and extensive historical accounts of the bloody conflict known as the Bitch Wars.
Which is just a crazy piece of history.
It really is. Plus, those absolutely haunting encyclopedias of Soviet criminal tattoos compiled by archivists like Arkady Branikov.
And Danzig Baldaev. Those are incredible visual documents.
They are. And we're going to track how this ascetic, radically anti-state prison cult, a group of men who literally swore an oath to never own property, somehow evolved over a century into a global shadow government.
Yeah, we are tracking the Russian Vory Zakone, the thieves-in-law.
The thieves-in-law, right.
So basically, we need to unpack how a criminal relies on a code of honor that explicitly rejects the world rather than a system designed to exploit it.
Which is a tough concept for us to grasp today.
It is. And to understand that, we have to travel back to the 1920s and 1930s, right to the crucible where this dark brotherhood was forged, the Solovki special camp.
Yeah.
How does a place like that even come into existence?
Well, the origin of Solovki is drenched in this dark historical irony. Because before the Bolshevik Revolution, the Solovetsky Islands, which are situated way up in the freezing waters of the White Sea.
Just incredibly isolated.
Exactly. It housed a deeply ascetic Russian Orthodox monastery. It was a place of extreme spiritual isolation where monks went to endure harsh conditions to, purify their souls.
Whoa.
But when Lenin and subsequently Stalin took power, they recognized the geographical utility of that isolation. They transformed this holy sanctuary into one of the earliest and most brutal laboratories of the entire Gulag system.
So you literally take a frozen monastery and turn it into a death camp.
Precisely.
And Stalin's regime is just funneling thousands of people into this meat grinder, political dissidents, intellectuals, peasants who resisted collectivization.
Anyone deemed an enemy of the state.
Right. But by the early 1930s, the state had effectively crushed the old-school political bandits and pre-revolutionary criminals. That left a massive power vacuum inside these camps.
And into that vacuum stepped a completely new breed of professional criminals. You have to understand, the conditions in Solovki were apocalyptic.
I can't even imagine.
Prisoners were forced into grueling manual labor, primarily chopping timber in sub-zero temperatures. They were systematically worked to death, fueled by starvation rations.
All for the economic benefit of the Soviet industrial machine.
Right. But a small, really hardened subset of criminals looked at this terrifying reality and made a radical philosophical decision.
Which was?
They decided that performing any manual labor whatsoever was an act of submission to the state.
Wow. So they just refused.
They refused. They chose to suffer horrific, agonizing punishments, solitary confinement in freezing cells, severe beatings, starvation, rather than lift a single axe for the regime.
And these men formed the original core of the Vory v. Zakone.
Exactly. They were the original thieves-in-law.
Wait, but if you don't work in a gulag, they cut your food rations down to practically nothing.
Nothing at all.
So how did they survive just saying no to the state?
Well, they survived by preying entirely on the other inmates. They basically became a violent, parasitic aristocracy. They would steal the food, the warm clothing, and the prime sleeping bunks from the ordinary working convicts, whom they called the muziki.
The peasants, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. But among their own kind, they demanded complete, unquestioning equality and ideological purity.
Which is fascinating. A parasite class that has total internal egalitarianism.
Right. And they codified this radical existence into the Vorovskoye Zakon, the Code of the Thieves.
And the sources detail that there were 18 core pillars to this code. Let's dig into the mechanics of this, because every single rule seems meticulously designed to sever the thief from the legitimate world.
What they dismiss as the sucker world.
Yeah, the sucker world. The first pillar is the most obvious, absolute, uncompromising rejection of the state.
And the rejection had to be total. A true Vor could never give a statement to the police. Never appear as a witness in a courtroom, never pay a tax, and under absolutely no circumstances could he serve in the military or take up arms for the government.
It's just complete non-participation.
It went even further. If a camp guard handed a thief a pack of tea and the thief accepted it, he could be stripped of his rank.
Just for taking tea.
Just for taking tea. He could potentially be murdered by his brothers simply for fraternizing with the enemy.
Okay, let's unpack this and compare it to Weinstein for a second. Weinstein used the legal system. He used district attorneys, private investigators, massive settlements to build a fortress around his crimes.
He manipulated the state.
Exactly. He weaponized it. But the Vory lived to spite the system entirely. Their mechanism of fear wasn't about losing a job or getting sued. It was about violating this sacred brotherhood.
That was the only law they recognized.
But it went so much further than just hating the police. I mean, having a family was strictly forbidden.
Completely banned.
Why ban something as fundamental as having a wife or kids?
The logic was rooted entirely in vulnerability. Rule number 3, severed family ties. Because family is the ultimate leverage.
Ah, leverage.
Right. The KGB was notorious for using relatives to extract confessions. If you have a wife or a child on the outside, the secret police can threaten them, imprison them, or worse, just to make you talk.
So they eliminate the weak point.
Exactly. To guarantee that a thief would never break under state pressure, his only recognized family had to be the criminal brotherhood.
That is so dark.
If a man had a wife, before he was initiated into the Vory, he was required to completely abandon her. Any emotional attachment to the outside world was considered a fatal flaw.
Just imagine this for a second. Imagine a criminal enterprise where refusing to accumulate wealth, refusing to have a family, and refusing to leave prison were the ultimate status symbols.
It's the anti-American dream.
Seriously. Because Rule 7 explicitly banned owning property. You could never own a house or a nice car.
Because property tied you to the bureaucratic grid. It put your name on a state registry.
You become visible to the state.
Exactly. And furthermore, it implied that you were prioritizing your own personal enrichment over the collective survival of the brotherhood.
Right, the community aspect.
The Vory viewed themselves as honest thieves, living in a fundamentally dishonest, corrupt Soviet society.
They actually called themselves honest thieves.
They did. They were required to live an ascetic lifestyle. When they did steal from the state or from corrupt officials, they were obligated to funnel a significant portion of those spoils into a communal treasury.
The obsche-
Yes, the Obschak.
But wait, how does a communal fund actually work inside a frozen gulag? It's not like they had offshore bank accounts or lockboxes hidden in the snow.
No bank accounts.
So what are they actually pooling together and how is it managed?
Well, the Obschak inside the camps functioned as an underground economy based entirely on vital commodities.
Like barter goods.
Exactly. They pooled tea, tobacco, warm clothing, smuggled alcohol, and favors.
Real survival gear.
One highly trusted thief, known as the keeper of the Obschak, would secretly manage this stash.
Oh, so they had a designated treasurer.
Essentially, yeah. And the primary purpose of this fund was to support members who were in solitary confinement.
To keep them alive.
Right. And to bribe camp guards when it was absolutely necessary for the survival of the group. It ensured that no true Vor ever went without the necessities of survival.
That actually sounds bizarrely socialist.
It's a dark mirror of the Soviet system itself. And free thieves operating outside the camps were also strictly obligated to smuggle resources back into the prisons.
I found a quote in one of Federico Vory's papers that perfectly captures this mindset. The thieves had a saying, "The home for angels is heaven, and the home for a Vor is prison."
It's poetic in a really grim way.
They didn't view incarceration as a punishment or like a temporary setback. It was where their society actually lived.
The outside world was just a hunting ground to forage for resources to bring back home to the Gulag.
Which brings up a logistical issue. Inside that prison home, they required a mechanism to resolve disputes, right?
Right, because you have all these violent men locked together.
Exactly. Because they shared communal resources and lived in impossibly tight, stressful quarters, conflicts were inevitable. They couldn't exactly call the camp warden to report a theft among thieves.
Definitely not. That violates Rule 1.
Therefore, they invented their own highly formalized judicial system known as the Skodka.
The thieves' court.
This wasn't just a chaotic mob voting on who to beat up. It was incredibly structured.
Very much so.
Let's say a thief broke a rule. Maybe he lied to a brother, or he failed to pitch a gambling debt. How does the Skodka actually play out?
So a gathering of his peers would be secretly convened. It is crucial to note that the Vory did not have a single boss of bosses like the Italian mafia.
No godfather figure.
No godfather. They operated as a collegial, egalitarian brotherhood among those who held the rank.
Okay.
The accused would be brought before the assembly, the transgression would be formally discussed, evidence or testimonies would be presented.
Like a real trial.
Just like a trial.
Yeah.
And if the man was found guilty, the punishment was decided collectively.
And those punishments were unfathomably brutal, especially when it came to gambling.
And gambling was huge.
It was a massive part of their culture, partly out of sheer boredom, but also as a test of nerve, right?
Right.
But if you lost a game of cards, you had to pay up immediately. What happens if a thief runs out of stolen cigarettes or tea to bet?
The sources describe a terrifying escalation here. If a thief ran out of material goods, he could bet his own body parts.
Ugh, just the thought of that.
Men would wager their fingers or their ears.
And if they lost?
If they lost, they were expected to sever the limb themselves, right then and there, or have a brother do it, to settle the debt.
They literally cut off their own fingers to clear a debt.
Yes. But if a thief simply refused to pay a debt, a concept known as becoming a fulo, that was a capital offense.
A death sentence.
The Skodka would formally sentence him to death.
And the execution wasn't carried out by some designated hitman. It was a collective duty.
Everyone was complicit.
If the Skodka decreed that a man had to die and you were handed the shiv and told to carry out the sentence, you did it.
You had no choice.
If you hesitated, you were deemed a traitor to the code and you were next. This internal policing was so flawlessly terrifying that it created an impenetrable shadow government.
The Soviet guards controlled the barbed wire, the watchtowers, and the gates.
Right.
But the Vory held absolute terrifying dominion over the population inside.
They maintained their own laws, their own courts, and even their own language.
Oh, Fenya.
Yeah, Fenya. This complex criminal slang that allowed them to plot and communicate openly in front of the guards without being understood.
He was a fully functioning counter-society.
But no isolated ecosystem lasts forever. The real world eventually violently crashed into the gulags, igniting what is arguably the most fascinating and bloody period in the history of the Russian underworld.
The Suka Wars.
The Suka Wars, or the Bitch Wars.
Let me take the lead on this because the historical context here is absolutely vital to understanding how the Russian criminal soul fractured.
Go for it. It's a massive turning point.
We have to set the stage in 1941. Nazi Germany launches Operation Barbarossa.
The invasion of the Soviet Union.
Exactly. It is a massive, devastating invasion. The Red Army is taking catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. We are talking about millions of soldiers dead, captured, or wounded in a matter of months.
Such staggering numbers.
Stalin is desperate. The state machinery is facing existential annihilation. So Stalin looks to the only place where he has a massive, captive, untapped reserve of manpower: the Gulag system.
He needed bodies. Exactly. The state apparatus makes an unprecedented compromise. Soviet officials enter the camps and offer a deal to the prison population, explicitly including the hardened criminals.
The very men who swore to destroy the state.
Right. They tell them, if you volunteer for the Red Army, if you join the penal battalions and fight the fascists on the front lines, your sentences will be reduced or entirely pardoned after the war.
A literal deal with the devil.
Now, think back to the Vorovskoy Zakone, the code of the thieves we just spent all this time detailing. Rule number 1. Total, uncompromising rejection of the state.
And rule number 10.
Yes, rule number 10. Never, under any circumstances, take a weapon from the hands of the authorities and never serve in the military.
So, to a pure traditional Voris, accepting Stalin's offer was the ultimate heresy.
It meant putting on the uniform of the very state that was enslaving them and fighting its wars. It was an unforgivable betrayal of the brotherhood.
But the psychological calculus for the prisoners was agonizing.
I mean, you're stuck in Siberia.
Right. The reality of the Gulag was slow, freezing starvation, and almost certain death. Hundreds of thousands of criminals looked at the horrors of the Siberian timber camps and calculated that taking their chances against the German army on the front lines was a marginally better bet for survival.
Which tells you how horrific the gulags were.
Absolutely. So a massive schism occurred. Many high-ranking thieves accepted the state's deal. They took up the rifles. They went to war.
Let's walk through the tactical reality of what these men endured. They were often placed in Strafbats.
The penal battalion.
The penal battalions.
Huh?
These units were given the most suicidal missions imaginable, clearing minefields by literally running through them.
Human minesweepers.
Yes,
Yeah.
or launching frontal assaults against fortified German machine gun positions. These criminals fought in the rubble of Stalingrad. They survived the massive tank battles at Kursk, and they pushed all the way to the ruins of Berlin.
They survived the absolute deadliest conflict in human history.
But here is the deeply tragic, profoundly cynical twist of Soviet history. When the war finally ends in 1945, Stalin reneges on the deal.
Of course he does.
The state needs free labor to rebuild the decimated country. So instead of granting the promised freedom, the KGB rounds up a huge percentage of these surviving veterans and throws them right back into the cattle cars.
Shipping them straight back to the Gulag.
Straight back to where they started.
And waiting for them inside those freezing barracks were the pure Vory, the zealots who had stayed behind,
The ones who kept the code.
the men who had starved, endured the solitary confinement, and kept the sacred code utterly intact.
When these combat veterans walked back through the gates of the camps, the pure Vory did not welcome them as heroes.
Not at all.
They looked at these men who had bled for the Soviet Union and declared them suki,
Bitches.
bitches, traitors to the criminal world. The pure thieves convened immediate skodkas, formally stripped the veterans of their rank, kicked them out of the brotherhood, and violently pushed them to the absolute bottom of the prison hierarchy.
Which was a death sentence in itself.
Because it meant the veterans were now targeted for the exact same abuse, theft, and extreme violence that the Vory normally inflicted on political prisoners.
But the traditional Vory made a catastrophic miscalculation regarding their enemy here.
A massive one.
They were accustomed to bullying terrified intellectuals, accountants, and peasant farmers. The men they were now trying to terrorize were heavily decorated, battle-hardened combat veterans.
Right. These Sukis had survived years of artillery barrages and brutal hand-to-hand trench warfare. They were absolutely not going to submit to being bullied by a group of emaciated gang members armed with sharpened spoons.
Exactly. The tactical reality of the camp completely inverted. The Suki possessed something the traditional thieves lack.
Which was military discipline.
Military discipline, pragmatic survival skills, and a willingness to organize tactically. When the pure Vory attacked, the Suki fought back with the coordination of an infantry platoon.
And furthermore, they made a massive philosophical pivot. They decided that if the old pure code had cast them out to die, they would write a new code.
A countercode.
And this new code explicitly allowed for cooperation with the prison administration in order to achieve dominance and survival.
And this ideological split ignites the Suka Wars.
From 1945 to roughly 1953, a full-scale, incredibly bloody civil war rages inside the Soviet penal system. We are talking about mass riots, barracks being heavily barricaded with bunk beds, and men slaughtering each other in the snow with shivs forged from iron bed frames.
And the reaction of the state apparatus to this is just a masterclass in ruthless manipulation.
They loved it.
They did. The camp administrators and the KGB watched the civil war erupt and realized they had been handed the ultimate solution to their biggest problem.
Because for decades, the state had been utterly failing to break the power of the Vory v. Zakone because the code of silence was impenetrable.
But now the underworld was tearing itself apart. So the guards actively weaponized the conflict.
How did they do that mechanically?
They essentially formed a covert alliance with the Suki. The administration would secretly supply the veterans with iron bars, heavy knives, and sometimes even look the other way while they accessed tools to build deadlier weapons.
While keeping the pure thieves unarmed.
Exactly. The guards ensured the pure Vory were subjected to frequent searches to keep them disarmed, and the guards would intentionally orchestrate bloodbaths.
Oh, this part is horrible.
They would take a small group of traditional pure Vory and lock them into a cell block entirely dominated by heavily armed Suki. Then the guards would just turn their backs and walk away, letting the slaughter unfold.
Just engineering a massacre.
Yes, and the violence utilized by the Suki wasn't solely about physical extermination.
Oh, it was psychological.
Deeply psychological warfare aimed at completely breaking the ideology of the pure thieves. When the Suki captured a traditional Vor, killing him quickly was often seen as a failure.
They wanted to destroy his soul.
And permanently erase his status. They instituted horrific, highly formalized rituals of submission.
The most famous of these is forcing them to kiss the knife. Walk us through how that actually worked.
It's brutal. A group of Suki would corner a traditional thief, hold a heavy blade to his throat, and present him with an ultimatum.
Right.
He had to verbally renounce the old Vorovskoy Zakone, acknowledge the supreme authority of the Suki, and kiss the blade of the knife as a physical act of total submission.
And if he did?
If he kissed the steel, his status as a pure Vor was instantly, irreversibly annihilated. He became a Suka himself, a broken man.
And if he refused?
The consequences were agonizing. He would be systematically beaten, often to death, or subjected to horrific sexual violence to permanently mark him as an untouchable outcast.
And the psychological traps were incredibly insidious. I read about this one trick the guards would play in coordination with the Suki.
The broom trick.
Yes. A guard would call a pure Vor out into the yard and hand him a simple wooden broom, ordering him to sweep the dirt. If the thief stood his ground and refused, the guard would severely beat him. But if the thief flinched, if he reached out and so much as touched the handle of that broom for a single second, the Suki, who were watching from the windows, would immediately declare that the man had just performed manual labor for the state.
Under the strict purity of the old code, touching the broom meant he was broken.
His rank was instantly gone. Over a broom.
Analyzing the geopolitical outcome of the Suka Wars reveals a fundamental alteration in the DNA of Russian organized crime.
Yeah, let's talk about the fallout.
By the early 1950s, shortly after the death of Stalin, the demographic of the gulags began to shift, and it became clear that the Suki had overwhelmingly won the war.
They won.
They achieved victory through superior numbers, tactical combat experience, and most crucially, by securing the covert backing of the state apparatus.
Here's where the contrast with our previous deep dives becomes so stark. Think about the Hollywood Complicity Machine.
Let's bring it back to Weinstein.
Right. Silence and cooperation were commodities bought with non-disclosure agreements, massive financial settlements, and the promise of future career advancement.
It was a cold, calculated business transaction.
You sign the paper, you take the money, you keep your mouth shut. But in the gulags, during the bitch wars, silence and non-cooperation was a sacred law that men willingly died for in the freezing mud.
They died for the code.
Hundreds, possibly thousands of pure Vory actively chose to have their skulls crushed with iron pipes rather than kiss a knife or take a sweeping job from a warden.
The tragic reality is that the victory of the Suki permanently shattered that dark monastic purity.
It broke the spell.
It forcibly introduced a new, ruthless pragmatism into the underworld. The conflict definitively proved that in order to survive, thrive, and maintain dominance, the criminal underworld could and indeed should cooperate with the corrupt, exploitable elements of the state.
Which changes everything.
That specific realization laid the foundational philosophical groundwork for the modern Russian mafia. The ascetic, suffering thief of the 1930s was slowly replaced by the pragmatic, cooperating gangster.
It's a wild paradox. By trying to completely exterminate the Suki, the pure Vory essentially guaranteed that the Suki's philosophy of pragmatic state cooperation would become the absolute future of Russian crime.
While the underlying ideology shifted dramatically towards pragmatism, one of the most visible, terrifying, and culturally rich aspects of the traditional Vory managed to survive the bitch wars completely intact.
Oh, I know where we're going.
It carried on for decades, functioning as the glue of the underworld. I am talking about the visual language of the Russian criminal.
Your tattoos.
The tattoos.
This is where the source material reads less like history and more like a dark, gothic fantasy novel. We're moving from the battlefield to the flesh. And I want you to take the lead here because you obsessed over this section in our prep.
I really did. It is, without exaggeration, the most complex, highly regulated system of criminal semiotics in recorded history.
Criminal semiotics, I like that phrase.
Think of the Gulag system as an environment of total bureaucratic erasure. The KGB could arbitrarily destroy your paper records, lose your file in a warehouse, or legally change your name to completely unmoor you from your identity.
You're just a number to them.
In that environment, a prisoner's physical body became his only unalterable resume. It was an analog blockchain written into the dermis.
I love that concept, a living ledger that can't be hacked or erased by a bureaucrat. Let's look at the Weinstein comparison again.
Right, the prestige currency.
Yeah. In Hollywood, power is backed by prestige currency. It's superficial. It's winning an Oscar, owning property in the right zip code, or making sure you are photographed on the red carpet standing next to the right politicians.
Right.
That carefully curated image is how you broadcast your invulnerability. But for the Vory, power was quite literally bled into their skin under the most unhygienic, excruciating conditions imaginable.
The physical process of acquiring these tattoos was an agonizing ordeal. We must constantly remind ourselves that they did not have sterile tattoo parlors or electric guns in the gulags.
No, it's all improvised.
The ink itself was a toxic concoction. Prisoners would take the rubber heels from old boots and burn them down to collect the heavy black soot.
Burning rubber.
They would then mix this soot with the prisoner's own urine to create a crude dark paste.
Oh my God, urine! Why urine?
Urine was specifically chosen because the prisoners believed it possessed antiseptic properties. Avoiding infection was paramount because contracting sepsis in a Gulag medical ward was essentially a death sentence.
So it was an act of desperation?
The needles were improvised from anything sharp they could scavenge. Sharpened guitar strings, heavy staples, or modified sewing needles bound to wooden sticks.
And they would just jam this into the skin.
They would forcefully puncture the skin thousands of times to inject this toxic rubber paste.
Just the physical act of getting tattooed was a massive, life-threatening display of endurance. You are enduring hours of pain and risking lethal infection just to update your resume. But the actual imagery, the encyclopedias by Bronnikov, are absolutely mind-blowing. Let's walk through the mechanics of what these symbols actually communicated to anyone who knew how to read them.
Let's begin with the most iconic symbol of the hierarchy, the 8-pointed star. This is the definitive mark of the Vory Zakone, the crowned thief-in-law.
The highest rank.
It denotes supreme authority. If a thief possessed these stars tattooed symmetrically on the front of his shoulders or just below his collarbones, it broadcasted that he was a general in the criminal underworld.
But the placement of the star completely changes the meaning, right? What if those same 8-pointed stars are tattooed directly over the kneecaps?
Placement is everything in criminal semiotics. Stars on the knees carried a highly specific, intensely defiant message. I kneel to no one.
That is so hardcore.
It was a physical vow that the wearer would never submit to the prison authorities, would never bend the knee to the police, and would never surrender to the state.
Then we have the religious imagery, which I found totally jarring.
It's very prominent.
You have these hardened men murderers, extortionists, guys who would cut your finger off over a card game, and yet their entirely scarred backs and chests are completely covered in massive, ornate Russian Orthodox churches, heavy crosses, and beautiful depictions of the Madonna. Why the sudden piety?
The religious imagery is a perfect example of how symbols are entirely repurposed by a subculture. The churches and crosses rarely had anything to do with actual spiritual piety or seeking forgiveness from God.
It's not about faith.
No, it was a deeply coded language. The most common motif is the sprawling Russian Orthodox Church. If a guard or a fellow inmate looks at a church tattooed across a prisoner's back, they don't admire the architectural linework.
What are they looking for?
They immediately count the cupolas, the onion domes.
Because every single dome represents a prison sentence the man has served.
Exactly that.
It is a literal, unalterable rap sheet etched onto his back. If he goes back to prison for a 5th time, he has to find an artist to painfully add a 5th dome to the church.
Yep. The cross was similarly repurposed. A specific type of cross worn on the chest often signified a prince of thieves, denoting one of the highest possible leadership ranks within the Skadka.
And what about the Madonna?
The image of the Madonna and Child Mary holding the infant Jesus carried a deeply cynical or perhaps profoundly tragic dual meaning. It translates to "Prison is my home."
Wow.
It publicly signified that the wearer had been entrenched in a criminal life since he was a young child, implying that the dark underworld was the only mother who had ever truly nurtured him.
We also need to talk about the animal tattoos because they operate on this weird, clever linguistic level. Let's talk about the cat.
The image of a cat is a traditional marker of a thief, specifically denoting a highly skilled pickpocket. But it operates primarily as a linguistic pun.
Right, because of the acronym.
Yes, the Russian word for cat is KOT. In the complex slang of the prison underworld, KOT was utilized as an acronym for Koronoe Obitatel Termi,
Which translates to
which translates directly to native prison inhabitant.
native prison inhabitant.
It was a profound badge of pride. It meant you belonged entirely to the zone. You were a native of the Gulag ecosystem.
And then there's the spider in the web. This one acts almost like a live status update on a social media profile, but permanently inked into the skin.
The spider is a dynamic symbol. The orientation tells the story.
Which way it's facing.
Right. If the spider is tattooed facing upwards, as if climbing the web, it actively communicates that the wearer is an active criminal, still fully engaged in the life and plotting his next move.
And if it's facing down.
If the spider's position facing downwards, it serves as a public declaration that the thief is attempting to leave the lifestyle, that he is retired, or is stepping back from the daily violence of the brotherhood.
There was one specific historical detail in the source material that I found both incredibly clever and overwhelmingly grim.
The dictators.
Yes, the portraits of Lenin and Stalin. Why on earth would these radically anti-state rebels, men who swore an oath to destroy the government, endure the pain of tattooing the massive faces of the ultimate Soviet dictators directly onto their chests?
It is a fascinating glimpse into prison mythology and desperate survival tactics. During the height of Stalin's Great Terror, thousands of prisoners were being marched out into the snow and executed by firing squads.
Just mass executions.
A persistent myth began to circulate throughout the camps. The prisoners believed that the firing squads, who were heavily indoctrinated Soviet soldiers or loyal Cheka agents, would absolutely refuse to fire a bullet into an image of their sacred deified leaders, Lenin or Stalin.
They literally thought it was a bulletproof vest made of ink.
They did.
They thought the guards would be too scared of committing ideological treason to pull the trigger.
They endured the painful tattooing of the dictators directly over their hearts or vital organs, clinging to the belief that it would save them from execution.
Did it work?
The profoundly tragic reality, of course, is that the NKVD executioners were brutally pragmatic. They simply adapted their protocol.
Meaning what?
If a prisoner was marched out and had Stalin tattooed across his chest, the guards just turned him around and shot him in the back of the head.
Unbelievable. Just completely cold. Now, considering how highly regulated this system was, the specific meanings of the stars, the precise counting of the domes, the orientation of the cats, what happened if a regular low-level inmate just looked at a high-ranking thief and thought, hey, that 8-pointed star looks intimidating. I'm going to get my buddy to scratch one onto my shoulder so people respect me.
Oh, that was a terrible idea.
How did they police that in a chaotic camp?
Forging an entry on the living ledger was a fatal mistake. The Vory referred to these as unearned tattoos.
Unearned.
The skin was considered a sacred, truthful document. To wear a symbol you had not earned through blood, time, and pack, and the explicit approval of the Skutka, was considered stolen valor of the highest, most offensive order.
And the policing was violent and immediate.
Very immediate. If a recognized thief saw a lower-level muzik sporting an 8-pointed star or wearing a specific ring tattoo on his finger that he hadn't earned, the confrontation was instantaneous.
The sources detailed the exact mechanics of the punishment. They didn't just beat the guy up. They offered a horrifying choice.
The offending inmate would be cornered and handed a piece of broken glass, a rough, heavy brick, or coarse sandpaper.
Oh, God.
He was commanded to remove the unearned tattoo himself, right then and there.
With a brick.
This meant he had to literally scrub, scrape, or carve the ink completely out of his own flesh, tearing through the dermis until the symbol was obliterated.
And if he couldn't do it...
If he refused the agonizing pain, or if he physically couldn't complete the task, the Vory would simply execute him.
It wasn't just edgy body art. It was a highly regulated, lethal caste system painted directly onto the body. And that brings us to the darkest application of this system.
The forced tattoos.
Right. We've talked about the tattoos worn with pride, but the living ledger was also weaponized. We have to look at the forced tattoos, the marks of permanent punishment.
The Vory understood that if a mark is permanent, it can be used to destroy a man's life forever. They utilized forced tattoos to permanently brand outcasts.
Like an informer.
Right. If an inmate was definitively proven to be an informer, a snitch working for the guards, he wouldn't always be killed. Sometimes a worse fate was holding him down and forcibly tattooing a derogatory, deeply offensive slur directly across his forehead.
Just branding him. Or the tattoos used to denote sexual status, which were inescapable.
The hierarchy of the Gulag was violently homophobic, and sexual violence was routinely used as a horrific tool of physical and psychological dominance.
It's incredibly dark.
If an inmate was deemed an untouchable outcast, or if he was forced into submission, the Vory would permanently mark him. He might receive a forced tattoo of eyes on his lower stomach or buttocks, or a crude image of a snake entwined with a naked woman.
And these functioned as permanent, inescapable scarlet letters.
Exactly. Because the prison population was constantly being shuffled between different camps across Siberia, the tattoo ensured that no matter where the man was transferred, the moment he undressed in the bathhouse, the entire new population would instantly read his degraded status.
He could never outrun his past or reinvent himself. Think about walking into a crowded, freezing, concrete bathhouse where every person's darkest deeds, their deepest loyalties, the murders they've committed, the exact number of years they've served, and their ultimate social status are broadcast on their skin for anyone fluent in the language to read.
It's overwhelming to visualize.
You can't hire a PR firm to spin your image. You can't lie about who you are because the absolute truth is burned into your chest. It is a society of radical transparency, completely alien to our modern world of digital profiles and deleted search histories.
It is radical transparency, but only accessible to those who possess the key to the code.
So we have built this incredible picture, an ascetic, heavily tattooed, fiercely independent criminal cult that survives the freezing horrors of Solovki.
Survives the meat grinder of the bitch wars?
Exactly, and solidifies its power. But empires eventually crumble. The Soviet Union doesn't last forever. As we move through the 1960s into the 70s and eventually hit the catastrophic collapse of the 90s, the world drastically changes.
And the Vory have to evolve or die.
How do we get from a half-starved man carving an 8-pointed star into his knee in a Siberian labor camp to a Russian mobster wearing an Italian suit laundering billions of dollars through luxury real estate in London and New York?
This is where we track the massive mutation from the prison cell to the global boardroom. The crucial evolutionary bridge occurs during the era of Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, spanning the 1960s and 1970s.
The era of stagnation.
Historians often refer to this period as the era of stagnation,
Yeah.
The official state-run command economy was failing miserably at providing for its citizens. There were massive systemic shortages of basic consumer goods.
We are talking about long lines just to buy toilet paper, let alone luxury items like decent shoes or a radio.
Precisely due to that systemic failure, an enormous black market organically rose up to fill the void.
Makes sense. Supply and demand.
In the Soviet Union, this massive shadow economy was operated by a class of illegal underground entrepreneurs known as the Tsekoviki.
The Tsekoviki.
These were incredibly bold men running secret, off-the-books factories. They were quietly producing everything from counterfeit blue jeans to household appliances, largely by bribing managers to let them use stolen state materials and speed machinery after hours.
But here's the critical vulnerability for the Tsekoviki. Because their entire business model is completely illegal under Soviet law, they operate entirely outside the protection of the state.
Exactly.
If a gang of thugs breaks into your secret blue jean factory and steals all your cash, you can't exactly dial the KGB and report a robbery. You'd be confessing to massive economic crimes.
They were sitting ducks generating massive amounts of illicit cash. They desperately needed physical protection.
And who possesses the violent capability and the widespread reputation to provide protection outside the boundaries of the law?
The Vory Zakone.
The underworld recognized the opportunity.
The Vory transitioned from being merely pickpockets and camp enforcers to providing a service called Krasha. The term literally translates to roof. But in the parlance of the Russian criminal world, it means violent, guaranteed protection.
Wait, providing organized protection for businessmen, actively participating in the real economy. Doesn't that directly violate the fundamental pillars of the old code?
Yes, rule number 2.
No legitimate labor and absolutely no helping the frary, the suckers of the outside world.
It was an absolute flagrant violation of the original monastic purity. But we must recall the brutal lesson internalized during the bitch wars.
Pragmatism.
Pragmatism always triumphs over purity. The surviving Vory looked at the Tsekoviki and realized the shadow economy was generating staggering, unprecedented amounts of cash. They started demanding a significant percentage of the Sekoviki's profits in exchange for keeping other gangs away.
And here's where the infection of true systemic corruption begins to spread.
Right, because the Sekoviki weren't just paying off the mafia, they were also funneling bribes to corrupt local Communist Party officials and police captains to ensure the secret factories weren't raided.
Ah, the birth of the symbiosis. You have the political elite, the illegal businessmen, and the violent criminal underworld all shaking hands in the dark.
For the first time in Soviet history, those three disparate factions are inextricably linked together in a highly lucrative economic ecosystem.
So the Vory are no longer isolated zealots rejecting the state.
They are actively greasing the hidden corrupt gears of the Soviet economy.
And then the ultimate catalyst occurs. The Berlin Wall falls. In 1991, the Soviet Union completely, breathtakingly collapses.
The end of an empire.
Nuclear clones and privatization vouchers.
It was the rapid gangsterization of a fallen superpower. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a chaotic, unprecedented fire sale of massive state assets.
Huge industries.
Enormous oil refineries, vast Siberian aluminum plants, national media companies, telecommunications networks, everything was suddenly up for grabs in a chaotic, poorly regulated rush toward privatization.
And who is perfectly positioned to take advantage of this chaos? Who has the massive reserves of hidden cash and the heavily armed violent muscle to intimidate the competition?
The guys who have been running the underground shadow economy for the last 20 years.
Exactly.
But as the stakes shifted from black market blue jeans to multi-billion-dollar oil fields, the profile of the top-tier criminal mutated again. We witnessed the rapid rise of the afterradity, the authorities.
The authorities.
These men are not the old, heavily tattooed ascetics who spent 20 years shivering in a gulag. The afterradity are a completely new, terrifying breed.
Who are they?
Many of them are highly trained former KGB intelligence officers who suddenly found themselves unemployed when the state collapsed. Others are hardened Special Forces veterans, the Spetsnaz, returning from the disastrous, bloody Soviet war in Afghanistan, only to find they have no pensions and no prospects in the new capitalist Russia.
Lethal guys.
Very lethal. Some are even Olympic-level athletes, wrestlers and boxers who realize their physical skills are highly valued as enforcers.
You essentially have a hostile merger. The traditional, violent criminal underworld absorbs the highly trained, coercive intelligence-gathering apparatus of the fallen state.
This new hybrid organization brings a terrifying level of sophistication to organized crime. They quickly realize that constantly shooting rivals in the streets with AK-47s attracts too much international heat and is fundamentally bad for long-term business.
Right. It's messy.
If you want to steal an entire aluminum plant, you don't send 50 guys in tracksuits to gun down the general manager. You use the law against them.
I want to focus on this because the irony is just staggering. The descendants of men who swore a blood oath to never cooperate with the legal system suddenly figure out how to completely weaponize it for corporate theft.
Write your stuff.
Yes. Let's walk through the exact mechanics of this. How does writer's-spo or corporate raiding actually work on the ground?
Writer's-spo is the pinnacle of modern corporate violence. It is a highly sophisticated multi-step process. Let's imagine a scenario. The afterradity identify a highly profitable, perfectly legitimate manufacturing business they want to absorb.
Okay, a target is set.
Instead of using physical violence initially, they leverage their immense wealth to bribe a carefully selected network, a corrupt local judge, a corrupt notary public, and perhaps a corrupt tax inspector.
The new Complicity Machine, but armed with actual state power.
Precisely. The criminals use the corrupt notary to forge a stack of complex financial documents. These forged documents falsely claim that the target business took out a massive loan from a shadowy shell company, which is secretly controlled by the mafia, and has defaulted on the debt.
Completely fabricated debt.
Completely fabricated. The criminals take these fake documents to the corrupt judge. The judge immediately rules in favor of the mafia's shell company, legally freezes all the assets of the legitimate target business, and appoints a bankruptcy trustee to take over the company's daily operations.
And let me guess, the bankruptcy trustee is just a high-ranking gangster wearing a very expensive Italian suit.
Exactly. The trustee orchestrates what is known as a maskey show.
Maskey show. This is where the physical intimidation finally enters the equation. Armed men wearing black ski masks, often off-duty police officers, moonlighting for the mob raid the factory under the guise of executing a legal court order.
So they use the cops.
Yes, They physically throw the legitimate owner out of the building. The trustee then legally transfers the ownership of the billion-dollar company to the criminal's offshore holding company.
And what happens if the real owner tries to fight back? If he runs to the local police chief to report the theft?
He quickly discovers that the local police chief is also on the mafia's payroll.
Nowhere to turn.
Suddenly, the legitimate owner finds himself facing completely fabricated, trumped-up charges of massive tax evasion or fraud, engineered by the corrupt tax inspector. He is threatened with prison unless he quietly drops his claims and walks away from his stolen life's work.
They literally behead the business using the state's own administrative, judicial, and law enforcement tools.
It's clean, it looks perfectly legal on paper to an outside observer, and it grants them total, unassailable control over massive sectors of the legitimate Russian economy.
The anti-state rebels of the frozen 1930s morphed into the shadow masters of the legal system in the 2000s.
The evolution is complete.
And this immense power and wealth didn't just stay confined within the borders of the Russian Federation. The sources heavily detail how this network expanded globally.
Oh, massively.
The U.S. Treasury Department actually had to designate them as a severe transnational criminal threat. They call this mass network the Brothers Circle.
The Brodsky Krug. As the Vory and the new Afterite consolidated their billions from aluminum, oil, and extortion, they required sophisticated international mechanisms to launder that wealth and safe havens to enjoy it.
They had to move the money out.
They spread out like a spiderweb across the globe. We reviewed declassified intelligence cables and international law enforcement reports detailing how high-level Russian organized crime figures are currently operating out of heavily fortified luxury villas in Madrid.
Madrid, yeah.
They are running incredibly complex real estate money laundering schemes through the gleaming towers of Dubai and setting up impenetrable networks of shell companies moving dark money through financial hubs in New York and London.
They evolved from freezing to death in Solovki to sunbathing on private yachts in Marbella.
It's an incredible trajectory.
But despite the billions and the bespoke suits, they still utilize the ancient structures, right? Does the Skudka still exist?
The structure survives, but the venue has upgraded. Today, a Skudka might take place on a massive private yacht anchored in the Mediterranean or in a heavily secured VIP room at a luxury hotel in Dubai.
So the meetings still happen.
They still mediate disputes, and they still issue progeny.
What are progeny?
They are formal, signed edicts communicating new rules, decisions, or death sentences across the global criminal network. The U.S. Treasury has explicitly identified key modern figures, men like Timur Mirzoyev and Lasha Shushanashvili, who act as vital nodes in this global network.
And they're coordinating with other cartels, right?
They don't just mediate disputes between rival Russian gangs. They act as high-level brokers and financiers for other massive international crime syndicates, facilitating global narcotics trafficking and cybercrime.
But the final evolution, and honestly the most chilling aspect of all the research we poured over, brings us right up to the bleeding edge of the present day.
This is where it gets really dangerous.
We are talking about the geopolitical reality from 2022 to 2026, because the relationship between the Russian state and the Vory has taken another massive, terrifying turn.
We have officially entered the era of the hybrid state, an alignment that international intelligence analysts are referring to as the Spook-Gangster Nexus.
Break this down for us, because the mechanics of this read like a paranoid spy thriller, but it is absolute, documented geopolitical reality.
To understand the nexus, look at recent geopolitical events. Following the severe escalation of tensions between Russia and the West, particularly in recent years, European capitals have executed mass expulsions of Russian diplomats and undercover intelligence officers.
They kicked the spies out.
The Russian state intelligence services, the FSB, the SVR, the GRU, suddenly found themselves severely lacking the necessary on-the-ground personnel they previously relied upon to conduct covert operations in the West.
They didn't have enough highly trained spies left in places like London, Berlin, or Warsaw.
Right. So if the GRU needs something blown up in Europe, but they don't have an agent in the country, who do they turn to?
They turned to the vast, deeply embedded, well-funded networks of the Russian organized crime diaspora.
State intelligence agencies began actively recruiting individuals with deep criminal backgrounds, smugglers, mafia enforcers, members of the Vory networks living abroad, to act as single-use or proxy agents.
To execute what kind of operations? What are these gangsters actually doing for the FSB?
They are executing highly kinetic, deniable operations. We are seeing Russian criminals contracted to commit acts of sabotage. They are orchestrating arson attacks against critical European infrastructure, like railways and logistics warehouses supplying allied nations.
Real kinetic warfare.
They are executing assassinations of political dissidents living in exile. They are utilizing their vast money laundering networks to secretly move illicit funds to destabilizing political extremist groups across Europe.
Why use a gangster who might get caught instead of training a new spy? What is the mechanical advantage for the Russian state?
Plausible deniability. It is the ultimate shield.
Because if they get caught,
Right. If a critical logistics warehouse in Poland mysteriously burns to the ground, or an outspoken opponent of the Russian regime is brutally murdered in a European capital, and local authorities manage to apprehend the perpetrator, who do they catch?
they catch a smuggler.
They catch a known smuggler or a low-level mafia enforcer. The incident can then be spun by Russian state media as a common criminal turf war, a business dispute gone wrong, or isolated mob violence.
It completely masks the hand of the state.
It shields the Kremlin from accusations of state-sponsored acts of terror.
The summary in one of the security reports we read was absolutely terrifying. They wrote, Russian intelligence operatives and Russian criminals are increasingly the exact same people.
It represents the ultimate, devastating culmination of their 100-year history. Think about the ideological journey. The men who started in the 1920s, starving in the snow, carving 8-pointed stars into their knees as a sacred vow that they would never, ever kneel to any authority.
The men who allowed themselves to be bludgeoned to death with iron pipes rather than take a rifle from a Soviet guard.
Their modern, billionaire descendants are now operating as the deniable, lethal paramilitary arm of the modern Russian state itself. The separation between the criminal underworld and the government have completely, totally collapsed.
Let's take a deep breath and zoom out, because this has been a massive, epic journey.
We covered a century of history.
We started with starving, desperate men in the frozen wastes of the Gulag archipelago, carving a radical ascetic code of honor in blood and boot soot. We watched them tear each other apart in the barricaded barracks during the Bitch Wars, fighting a bloody civil war over the philosophical definition of survival.
Survival and purity.
We saw them morph into violent Croatia enforcers navigating the black markets of the 70s, evolve into billionaire oligarch gangsters orchestrating highly complex corporate raids in the 90s, and now, today, they operate as a deeply entrenched global network directing international cybercrime and acting as the deniable sabotage wing of a massive superpower.
It is a terrifying, awe-inspiring testament to ruthless adaptability.
And if we bring it all the way back to where we started, to the contrast with the Weinstein Complicity Machine, Hollywood power relied entirely on the illusion of prestige. It relied on the fragile mechanisms of legal red tape, aggressive PR firms, and the fear of losing a career to enforce its silence.
A very fragile system.
When the spotlight finally hit that machine, when the illusion was pierced by reality, the machine broke. But the Vory, they built a machine that never relied on illusion. It relied on a permanent, inescapable, visceral brotherhood.
They created a world where your resume, your darkest sins, and your absolute loyalties are carved permanently into your flesh.
You cannot issue a PR statement to change a tattoo. You cannot buy your way out of a Skudka death sentence with a non-disclosure agreement.
It is a dark, enduring resilience. And as we synthesize all of this, it leaves us with a profound, deeply unsettling thought to mull over.
What's that?
We look at the Vory v. Zakone as a fascinating historical anomaly, a unique product forged in the extreme, unrepeatable brutality of the Soviet Gulag system, but analyze the underlying mechanics of what they accomplished. If a criminal subculture can survive by creating a completely parallel functioning society, their own system of absolute laws, their own functioning courts, their own taxation and welfare system, and their own indelible visual language, a system so robust and adaptable that it outlasts the very global empire that built the prisons to hold them. What does that say about the fragility of our own legitimate society?
When you frame it like that, it's chilling.
Consider the implications for today. When our legitimate state institutions fail to provide basic justice, when the legal system is increasingly perceived as hopelessly corrupt or completely inaccessible to the average person, when the global economic order leaves vast swaths of the population desperate and abandoned, What kind of shadow governments, what new radical codes of honor are quietly forming in the dark gaps of our world right now?
Wow.
Nature fundamentally abhors a vacuum, and power will always inevitably find a structure. The question we have to ask ourselves isn't whether another shadow empire will rise from the margins. The question is, what brutal symbols will they carve into themselves to declare their defiance?
That is an image that is going to stick with me every time I look at how the systems around us operate. Remember, the red carpet is designed to hide the dirt beneath it, but the Gulag forces you to wear your absolute truth on your skin. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Until next time, keep questioning the structures around you.